Thank you all for joining us for the next webinar in our AFB research series, From Research to Practice, Making Educational Technology Accessible for All Students. We are now live and ready to begin.
All right, thanks, Kelly. My name is Stephanie, and I am the Chief Public Policy and Research Officer at the American Foundation for the Blind. We are really pleased to spend this window of your time with you as we endeavor to share information from our research space and some practical applications that you may find very interesting. I will go ahead and pass it over to the leader of our research space, which is Dr. Ariel Silverman.
All right, thanks so much, Stephanie, and thanks everyone for being here today. Really glad you're here. So today our focus is going to be on educational technology accessibility. And so we'll start off by talking a little bit about what is educational technology, what do we mean by accessibility, and why is accessibility important, both from kind of a practical perspective and then also from a regulatory perspective. Then we are going to share a little bit of research that AFB worked on around the time of the pandemic when there was a lot of virtual learning going on. And we learned about blind and low vision students' experiences both in K through 12 and in higher ed. And we want to emphasize that even though a lot of the research was during the pandemic, we know that virtual digital tools are not going away. They're still very critical in education, and it's still very critically important to ensure accessibility. And on that note, after we present the research, our public policy and research advisor, Sarah Malaire, is going to talk about how we can implement accessibility into ed tech tools, both as ed tech developers and then for those of you who are involved in procurement, how do you procure accessible technology for your schools or other places where you may be working? Just as a housekeeping note, if you have questions or comments during the webinar, you're encouraged to share in the Q&A box. We will have one of our other staff, Dr. Bagoon, will be answering some of the questions. And then at the end, we have set aside some time for live Q&A. So she will present some of the questions that were asked that were maybe bigger questions that could elicit a little bit of discussion. And then we will also give people the opportunity to raise hands and come off mute and ask questions verbally if you choose. I also want to mention that we are very pleased to be working with two doctoral students this year at AFB, and both of them are going to be participating in the webinar today. We have Mailian Vader, who is a doctoral student in human-centered computing at University of Maryland, Baltimore County. You'll hear from her in a little bit. And then we also have William Hanashock, who is a doctoral student in special education at Slippery Rock University, and he is going to take us through the next couple of slides. So we'll pass it to him.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Silverman. I really appreciate that. So we're going to start by going over what is educational technology. When we think of ed tech, when a lot of times people want to think about assistive technology as well. They're two separate processes. Where ed tech is for everyone within the classroom, assistive technology is generally for the learner with a disability. But just to start, I want to go over a simple definition of educational technology. And this comes from the Association of Educational Communications and Technology. Educational technology is defined as the ethical study and application of theory, research, and practices to advance knowledge, improve learning and performance, and empower learners through strategic design, management, implementation, and evaluation of learning experiences and environments using appropriate processes and resources. So when we think of educational technology, a lot of times people will think of Zoom as a educational technology tool, learning management systems such as Blackboard, as well as different assessment tools such as Quizlet. So all of those are general educational technologies. One quote that I found that was very, very impactful. It is EdTech paired with knowledge is when it is most powerful. So we want to try to pair the knowledge of the teacher, learner, etc., with the EdTech. Next slide, please. Thank you. So now we're going to kind of switch gears a little bit over to the accessibility side of things. When we think of accessibility, a very, very basic definition is just making things manageable, making things accessible, and making things adaptable for individuals with disabilities. But a more involved, a more robust definition is accessibility. And this is defined by the United States Department of Education. Is a person with a disability is afforded the opportunity to acquire the same information, engage in the same interactions, and enjoy the same services as a person without a disability in an equal, effective, and equally integrated manner with equal with excuse me with equal access. So when we're looking at accessibility, we want the equal access for the learner to have the same access to everyone within their classroom within their educational space. Next slide, please. So why does accessibility matter? So we're going to look at this from two different perspectives. We're going to look at it from the learner perspective as well as from the perspective of educational institutions. When we look at it from the learner perspective, educational technology specific to the accessibility side of things, it increases the inclusion and socialization of the learner. So whenever I'm working with my students out in the field, when all their friends are completing assignments, when all their friends are completing activities, the issue comes whenever my student is not able to access the same materials. I recently was working with a young man who was trying to complete a math assignment online, and the images on there were not accessible for them. So they had to sit with their paraprofessional. The paraprofessional read the assignment to them and described the pictures to them. Unfortunately, this limited their inclusion with their peers. While all their peers were working in a group, my student was with the paraprofessional going over the information. It also increases independence. Touching back on a paraprofessional, if the paraprofessional wasn't involved, my students being independent, my students accessing the material on their own. So having that accessibility aspect with the educational technology is so vital. And then finally, increases engagement. Instead of my student doing a pencil and paper worksheet, or my student, using traditional Perkins Braille, if they're able to access material online, it's more motivating, more engaging for them, and that thus has the possibility of increasing their learning potential. From the educational institution side of things, accessibility is also so vital. It limits wasted resources and instructional time. So if we're able to have our student use the educational technology that's already accessible, this limits a need for other individuals to be brought in a picture. Recently I was working with a team where they were trying to utilize this one gaming website, and unfortunately it was not accessible for my student using Job Access with Speech JAWS. It is a screen reading software. So in turn, we had to reach out to the company that makes the software. We had to reach out to the program. We had to get everyone kind of intertwined on the same page to make it accessible for my student. And it ended up costing the school district a lot of money, unfortunately. Um, Touching on the next point, it also engages a need for outside agencies. If we're able to have the material and have the educational technology be accessible from the bat, this limits the need for those outside agencies. And finally, one of the biggest ones is whenever we limit potential legal matters. I was recently working with a school district that they were utilizing a computer software to where it was a training software for various common products on a computer, and it was not accessible for my student. The school district ended up actually considering legal action against the company for that. So by having accessibility in mind when developing these educational technologies and these educational products, this would limit the potential for litigation. Um, and so now I'm going to be passing it over. And so now I'm going to be passing it over to Sarah.
Great. We can go to the, yep. So my name is Sarah, and I work primarily in the public policy space. This has a very strong interconnection with educational technology. Federal agencies have interpreted the Americans with Disabilities Act and other civil rights law to require accessibility in the digital space and on the internet since as early as 1995, when the internet was pretty new. But just within the last couple of years, there has been the completion of a rule for state and local governments, as well as recipients of federal funding from the Department of Health and Human Services, that requires those entities, which includes preschools, schools, public colleges and universities, as well as college and university programs that are receiving funding from the Department of Health and Human Services, to provide fully accessible websites, web content, and mobile apps in order to facilitate access to programs and services and information. And so this really covers a lot of the websites and apps that are being used by or owned by schools, whether that's to provide information about, what's going on in the classroom, the organizational components, information about school activities, as well as the instruction that's being provided in the classroom. And these rules begin to go into effect in 2026, so that Department of Justice's Title II rules will go into effect for larger districts. So those are ones in areas larger than 50,000 people on April 24th, 2026. And smaller districts must comply with by April 26th of 2027. So we can go to the next slide. And so what does this mean, both for schools and for the vendors that are providing educational technology that's being used by students and parents with disabilities? So websites and apps will need to meet the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1, levels A and AA. And this is a standard, it's internationally accepted, that defines what it means to have an accessible website. And it has kind of corollaries for mobile apps as well. So this really provides vendors in schools with a sense of what it means to make things accessible, and a goal to work towards when you're trying to develop an accessible educational technology environment. There are limited exceptions to this rule, but they're pretty limited. The exceptions are for things like databases of archived content. So if something was on the website, you mark it as archived, so it's out of date. That doesn't necessarily have to be made accessible. If you've got a research database that is exclusively for research, some of that content doesn't necessarily have to be remediated immediately, and it can be done on a case-by-case basis. Things like pre-existing social media content, so social media that was put out before the rule goes into effect, or things like individualized PDFs and certain other documents that are contained within a portal behind a password. Those are the kinds of things that are accepted from the rule. But even if there is an exception that applies to certain kinds of content, and in most cases, educational technologies don't qualify for these exceptions. But even if it does apply, schools still need to provide effective communication, reasonable modifications, and an equal opportunity for students and parents with disabilities to participate in all of the activities. So with that rule kind of giving us a framework for what we're working towards, I will turn it back over, I think, to May for AFB's research.
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah. My name is May, and I will be talking a little bit about some of the research that AFB has conducted. So AFB has conducted a series of different research studies that explored the experiences of blind and low vision students and their access to digital educational tools. So some of the interesting findings we got from these studies have to do with the number of digital tools that students used during the pandemic. So students used an average of 4.9 digital tools or software programs during the pandemic. These tools could include different kinds of video conferencing applications like Google Meets, Zoom, or WebEx, for example, as well as different learning management systems like Canvas or Blackboard. Out of these tools, more than half, 2.7, were identified as being inaccessible in some capacity by the students. This means that whatever assistive technology they were using, they were unable to fully access the information or all of the features of that specific digital tool. When the teachers were asked about these inaccessible tools, roughly 60% of them said their students had to use at least one inaccessible tool, while about 35% said the students had to use at least two inaccessible tools. Next slide, please. So on this slide, we'll talk about some of the different challenges and problems that were identified with the current educational technology tools. For example, some of the tools would only work with a mouse and not any other input devices like a keyboard. This made it extremely difficult for users to access information that was included in that tool. Participants also reported instances where the photos or videos did not have descriptions or captions. This resulted in completely inaccessibility to these resources presented in these photos or videos. In addition to the specific lack of captions, there were more general complaints of tools not working with a variety of different types of assistive technologies, like different screen readers and screen magnifiers. In certain situations where timed assessments and games were used, like a timed quiz or test, students found the time constraints prevented them from keeping up with the material. For example, students who used a screen magnifier needed additional time to read the page with their screen magnifier, and the timed assessment would time out before they could finish the assessment. And lastly, students reported that certain computers with smaller screens made it difficult for their screen magnifiers to read all of the text. Next, we're going to hear from Ariel on the impacts of inaccessible technology.
All right, so next slide, please. So we conducted most of these findings that we talked about came from two studies that we conducted. And the first one was a survey of parents and educators of blind and low vision students in K through 12 education. And then we followed up with interviews and focus groups with mostly with parents and also with some educators. And that was a really good way to drill down a little bit further and get more detailed, in-depth kind of information about how accessibility barriers impacted students. And we got, a lot of really compelling stories. What I really remember the most is parents of middle school and high school aged students. So these were not little kids, these were teenagers or preteens. And they would say that their children would be in tears every day or, very often because either they were really frustrated, they couldn't get the technology to work, or they felt left out, excluded. There was an example of a student who was playing a game with his peers and the game kept timing out. And because it was harder for him to access using a screen reader, he kept timing out of the game and he felt, very upset because he wasn't able to play the game with his peers. And of course, he also wasn't able to take advantage of the learning opportunities involved. So a lot of kind of negative emotions that the students experienced. And then, of course, it created and creates still a burden upon, Will was talking about the burden, extra burden on teachers. It also creates a burden on parents or siblings or other family caregivers who have to give up their time to help the student click the mouse through the activities or turn the program on and off or whatever it is that the student is unable to do independently. We also had examples of times when students were exempted from assignments or projects or lessons because the tool was inaccessible, and that resulted in a disadvantage to the student in terms of, so, on the surface, maybe it felt good to the student to not have to do that assignment, but in the long term, it creates a disadvantage for learning and participation in future activities. Next slide, please. Here on the slide, we just have a couple of quotes from the first quote is from a teacher, and then the second quote is from a family member about experiences they had trying to advocate to improve the accessibility of digital tools. The teacher was talking about how nearly all of the platforms that districts used were inaccessible, and they tried to reach out to 2 different companies to make them aware of this issue, and they felt like all they ever really get is an empty apology and a promise that they are committed to making their sites or their apps inclusive to everyone. And the teacher says, I don't think they have the slightest clue of where to begin. The other quote was from a family member about a program that their child had to use that was not set up for a screen reader. There were videos that were not audio described, so they couldn't access the material. And when they tried to speak to the IT department, they were told that the district could not implement any changes to make the program accessible. And so our hope with this webinar is that by providing education and kind of practical guidance, that ed tech companies and school district professionals will be able to help move some of those barriers away, so that educators and parents don't have to fight so hard for accessibility. Next slide, please. I also want to talk a little bit about the findings with regard to higher education, because the digital tools definitely do not go away. And in fact, in my observation, I think digital tools are used even more frequently in higher education than in K through 12, because there is a lot more independent learning that happens. And so this is a different study. It was also done during COVID times. And we found that we had 75 respondents who were college students who were taking their classes totally online, and 51 of them were taking hybrid classes that met like one day a week in person and then the other days online. And we found that out of these students, 21 of them said that they had to drop a class and 18 had to take it incomplete because they couldn't access the digital tools that were required. Online learning management systems, web-based discussion boards, and or web-based word processing created challenges for those students. Similar types of challenges as to what May was talking about with the high school or the K through 12 students in terms of programs that can only be operated with a mouse, videos not being described or captioned appropriately, etc. Next slide, please. And then after the pandemic, we also did a study that was looking at accessibility barriers more generally amongst blind and low vision adults. And we had about 400 adult respondents who took the survey. And we found that 137 of them reported that in the year 2022, they had taken courses at the college level and they had used web-based tools in those courses. So it's quite common to be required to use those tools. 59% of them said that they experienced occasional accessibility barriers, meaning that they had accessibility barriers sometimes, but less than half the time. And then another 29% reported that they faced frequent barriers, meaning that over half the time they had difficulty with these websites. And then there was a similar trend, although apps were less commonly used. There were only 69 respondents who said that they used apps for college courses. We found that 46% of them had occasional barriers and 38% of them had frequent barriers. And I think it's interesting the prevalence of occasional barriers because it suggests that there's some inconsistency, right? Like sometimes some of the programs work well, or sometimes the websites work and sometimes they don't. And so it's not necessarily always the case that people are dealing with a program or a site that is always inaccessible, but it's often that people are dealing with multiple tools. Some of them are accessible, some of them are not. Some of them are partially accessible and they find workarounds. But there's a lot of variability in the accessibility of these tools. And now I will pass it back to Sarah.
Great. We can go to the next slide. Oh, no, never mind. Sorry. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of shifting the environment and beginning, what are the high level steps for beginning to fix these issues? And really, there's two places that make a huge difference, and that is in the design and development of ed tech tools, kind of at the product level, as well as procurement of those tools. So in 2022, when our pandemic era research was coming out, we put together a very brief guide on EdTech, primarily designed to get the attention of EdTech companies and begin to raise the importance of this issue. Some of the recommendations that come out of this look at, you know, what can be done, what can be done at the product level to make sure that we're making a difference, not just for one child in a classroom or one student, but for thousands. When EdTech is designed accessibly, um, that product development has a systemic impact on students' access to education. And this requires thinking about things from a policy perspective, a practice perspective, and a people perspective. So when we think about people, in EdTech design, we're going to need employee expertise. People need skills. They need exposure to or experience with disability. And they need time and directives to prioritize accessibility. And policy matters. Yeah, I talked a little bit about why we're working toward on a timeline to get to more accessible EdTech. So there's a legal policy, but organizational policy matters too. Having an accessibility policy internally, building an internal accessibility culture, and building that policy and letting it inform the workflow of each product development is super important. As well as communicating to customers who are often schools, but sometimes individuals as well, what the status of your accessibility or commitment to accessibility, and putting that on your website through an accessibility policy is also really important. Then you, of course, have your practices. And one way to think about this is by following your standards, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 or 2.2, and meeting the requirements of the rule or exceeding the requirements. And that is really at every stage of development. When you have your designers working to create a new project, when you've got your developers implementing that vision, and when you've got your usability testing or your experience testing to make sure that it works for your customers. So it's really important to test products often for accessibility, making sure that accessibility is integrated early in the process, and then hiring testers who have disabilities to make sure that what you've done works, because it's really better to make sure that this accessibility gets done at the beginning rather than after it gets rolled out to a customer. And speaking of customers, accessibility support is really critical. Listening to customer experiences and complaints, answering their questions, but also prioritizing accessibility feature requests. In some domains, there's kind of a popularity, which feature request is most popular gets implemented. But when it comes to accessibility, sometimes it's a relatively small number of people making those requests, but they have a really huge impact on people's ability to access that tool. So thinking about prioritizing accessibility feature requests can be an important part of a workflow to make sure that accessibility is resolved. And then you're also documenting accessibility issues. We recognize that accessibility is a journey. It is not something that you do once. So figuring out where the accessibility problems are now, documenting them, figuring out how to address them and the order in which that needs to be done is really important. And that helps you communicate to your customers what you know about your accessibility and communicate when they can expect improvements and maybe how to help work around them. And related to that is ensuring that when you update a product, that it doesn't introduce an accessibility bug. One thing that we've really heard a lot in our research, not just in the EdTech space, but in any kind of digital accessibility environment, is that product updates have a tendency to break accessibility. And that's because you might have integrated accessibility into the initial rollout of a product. But if there's a team that's really moving fast to put out a security update or a new feature, sometimes it doesn't get passed through the accessibility team. And so that's where having clear accessibility culture and workflow can be really important for resolving those product updates. And so that's just kind of the high level of how to get started on accessible design. Related to that is accessible procurement. So if you have an accessible product, we want to make sure that people are out there using those accessible products. And so schools and school districts, the state and local educational agencies really are having to think about the procurement process to make sure that they are ready for the legal requirements that are coming, but also so that they continue to meet their student needs. As William said, I mean, this is really something that affects the student experience, but it also affects the experience of your teachers. So the procurement process can significantly influence, both whether digital learning tools and platforms used in the classroom are accessible, but also whether students have access to the right hardware. And I believe May mentioned that large screens are something that came up a lot during the pandemic, both for students with disabilities and teachers with disabilities. Another part of procurement is making sure that it's not just that you're getting an accessible product to students, but that you're getting it to them and you're getting their assistive technology to them in a timely manner. So making sure that accessibility is built into the procurement workflow. I want to share just a couple of stories that directly relate to procurement from a teacher perspective. During the pandemic, we had a teacher who said all of the students got the smallest size Chromebook possible. I was requesting a lot of extra equipment for my students because the Chromebook wasn't accessible. Last spring break, when COVID hit, the district did a great job of getting the kids equipment right away. But when they purchased for the next school year, the VI kids, the blind students, weren't thought about. Once we could justify it, they were great. But it took way too long because everyone was ordering tech at the same time. So this is where, thinking about accessibility second means that students with disabilities are not getting access to the technology that they need in the classroom at the same time as their peers. Another teacher said software platforms were really inaccessible. They should be way more accessible, and a universal requirement for a school district to only purchase accessible software makes it so much harder for my kids to access the content. So I think in a lot of ways, we've addressed this with the Title II rule. There is now a universal requirement for accessibility, but school districts also play a role in making sure that that's carried out at their individual district level. So then some tips on accessible procurement, and we can go to the next slide. Sorry, we can go next slide again. So there's a couple of different legal bases for accessible procurement. Of course, we've talked about the ADA Title II rule from the Department of Justice that applies to state and local governments, including school districts. But then there's also longstanding provisions in the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act that requires students to receive accessible instructional materials. And those are referred to as NIMAS and NIMAC. And so that's a little bit of a different environment, but there are longstanding processes for getting digital instructional materials that are similar to textbooks into the hands of students in an accessible way. I want to credit a little bit of the resources here to an organization called Academy. That's a technical assistance center funded by the Office of Special Education Programs at the U.S. Department of Education. So the National Center on Accessible Digital Educational Materials and Instruction. They're a great place to go for resources, and their sole purpose is to provide technical assistance to local schools and their vendors on making sure that the educational technology that students are using is accessible. So some of the things to consider in an accessible procurement process, and this is throughout the process, is making sure, again, policies and procedures should prioritize accessibility. And then that means that you are considering what is accessible now, what do you need to do to get to an accessible educational technology environment, and building that workflow. So that could mean putting out a request for proposals that includes an accessibility requirement. That also considers when you're scoring a contract to procure a new educational technology um, device or software, you're considering accessibility among the components alongside things like cybersecurity, the adequacy of the pedagogy and whatever other features are important to your school district. It means making sure that your contracts embed accessibility requirements and that they're clearly defined. Um, and then you're requiring evidence of accessibility. So this is before you issue a contract, during and after. So looking at the conformance reports that are provided by an EdTech vendor, and the voluntary product accessibility template is one of the most common ways to demonstrate accessibility. Making sure that it's up to date, and asking questions about things that are identified as not being accessible. From a procurement officer perspective, it's also important to get an accessibility demo. If you're getting a product demo, there may not be enough time for looking at specific accessibility features, but asking for a second demo that specifically looks at how it's going to serve your students with disabilities can be a really important part of seeing what it looks like from a student perspective or a teacher perspective. And then doing your own testing can also be a really important part of making sure that what the vendor says about their accessibility is actually true and it's going to work for your students. And then just like we said that ed tech vendors should be providing accessibility support, documenting where from a school district perspective or a school perspective, documenting where you have problems and communicating with that vendor about those issues is really important to getting those issues resolved. And I've included a link on this slide to Incademy and their procurement resources. So next slide. I think this is turning it back to Ariel.
All right, thanks so much, Sarah. So we have a slide here with links to some resources, and I know there was a question about how to access the data that had been discussed earlier. And there's a couple ways to do that. So I did list a link to the access and engagement, which was the title of our pandemic era research that we did with K through 12 education. So if you go to www.afb.org/access engagement, you should be able to find the full reports from all three of the studies that we did. So those are the long reports. Those have all the data and all the stories and everything. We also have, and it's not here on this, well, I guess I'll go through what is on the slide and then I'll mention a couple other easy resources. So if you go to www.afb.org/edtech, we have a toolkit that is printable that has a lot of the same kind of guidance that was just discussed about buying for inclusion in the procurement space and then developing accessible EdTech products. So that's a handy resource that you can review or you can share with colleagues or people you know in the field. If you have questions, if you want to, of course, we'll have some Q&A time now. But if you have thoughts after the webinar, if you have ideas that you want to talk about with AFB, AFB is always interested in partnering with other organizations that are advocating for accessibility. We also have a professional services line, including digital accessibility testing and remediation services that we can offer. We can work with organizations to help conduct research, needs assessment kind of work. If you're interested in any of that, you can just email us at research@afb.org and we can set up a time for a conversation. Lastly, I'll mention our research page, which is www.afb.org/research. I neglected to put it on the slide. But that page includes short summaries of all of the studies that we've done in the last 6 years. So that includes short summaries of all of the pandemic era studies that we did that we talked about today, short summaries of our Barriers to Digital Inclusion series, which was the survey that I mentioned with adults about accessibility barriers. We also did a diary study to look in more depth at people's experiences with accessibility barriers, not just limited to education, but in all domains. So we have short summaries of all those studies linked off of afb.org/research. We also have the EdTech toolkit. We have another toolkit that is for teachers of the visually impaired, general education teachers, families, and students who are blind or low vision, and school administrators. So that toolkit is also linked off of afb.org/research. So that's the resources that we have. I forgot to mention at the beginning that there was a mix-up with the slides. So you may have received a slide deck from a previous webinar in your email, and we apologize for that. We did put a link in the chat to the current webinar slide deck, and we will also be sending that out tomorrow when we send our follow-up email. So now we can go into our question and answer, and there is one more slide. That slide just contains some references for some of the information that was shared. So if you want to look up any references from any of the slides, you can find them on the final slide in the slide deck. I don't believe, do we have any new Q&A items?
We do not yet. Certainly can give people a minute to chat. There we go.
I think we just got one.
When did you say this new law takes effect, and how long do schools have to comply? Sarah, can you go over the timelines again for folks?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Title II rule that applies to state and local governments on their website and app accessibility goes into effect for larger localities beginning on April 24th of 2026. So less than a year from now. And then for smaller districts, that will be on April 26th of 2027. So they've still got just under 2 years. And the way that that's defined, a larger school district would be a school district that serves an area with more than 50,000 people. It doesn't necessarily mean that the school district serves 50,000 students. It's that they're in a community that is 50,000. Hopefully that helps.
And am I correct that in this case, when it goes into effect, is the compliance date? People need to be in compliance by that deadline.
Correct.
Before we go to the next question, I just wanted to take a moment to thank our ASL interpreters, Maddie and Jamie, who have been on the webinar providing ASL for anybody who might need it or anybody who watches the webinar recording later. So thank you, Maddie and Jamie.
We have a question asking, are there any lists of accessible versus inaccessible educational technologies or good sites for online reviews?
I can try to answer this question. This is Sarah. I'm not aware of them. I think that this is definitely an idea that has been floated in a couple of different environments. One challenge with making a list of accessible or inaccessible EdTech documents or products is that as soon as an update is made, they can be out of date. So that is one challenge to doing an online database. There may be some publications that do reviews, but I'm missing that off the top of my head.
I take these a little bit out of order. Do you have any recommendations for training courses, webinars, or other resources on Title II and/or for employee accessibility training as well?
This is Sarah. I definitely want to plug again the Academy. That's the Technical Assistance Center on so the National Center on Accessible Digital Educational Materials and Instruction. I think is a great start. They have webinars, and they are continuing to build their resources. They're relatively new Technical Assistance Center. There's also a webinar that the Department of Justice created on the Title II rule, and they published a link to that on their website. You can find that at ada.gov.
Excellent. I see a hand raised. Do we want to go to a verbal question from Hilton Schwartz?
Hilton, if you would like to ask your question, you can just unmute.
Go ahead, Hilton.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm sorry, slightly inaccessible technology. I'm looking at a different part of the educational tech, and I'm wondering if you could point to some resources. So for a person who has recently become disabled, in my case, blind, and somebody hands you an iPhone or an Android phone, and you want to get instruction in it, so you go to instructor, what certification would a person need to be an instructor to show somebody who became recently blind how to use a device? What curriculum or testing would such an instructor be able to use or find in order to follow, I'm going to say, a well-researched best practices kind of journey in teaching this? It's kind of a bootstrap problem. Like, how do you begin to begin? So
Sure.
there's a lot of stuff like once you know how to use Zoom, once you know how to use Excel, once you know how to use Word, once you know how to use all those things, then that's where you fall into this particular seminar. I'm looking at the step before. How do how does the instructor teach you? How does the instructor find resources or get certified in order to teach just how to use the device or to use
Yeah,
the basic apps? Thanks.
absolutely. That sort of instruction in assistive technology and in how to navigate the world accessibly in a non-visual fashion after you've spent a lifetime doing it with your eyes is often taught by a certified vision rehabilitation therapist or by a certified assistive technology instructional specialist. Uh, those certifications are obtained by somebody going to a master's program learning about rehabilitation. There are also non-certified professionals who work in those spaces, sometimes people who have gone to apprenticeship programs to learn the skills to teach assistive technologies, sometimes people who are expert users themselves because they have a lot of lived experience and have used a technology and are particularly technologically apt and take on a mentorship role where they teach other people what they know so very well. So there are quite a few paths to an instructor. Finding that instructor is very dependent on what sorts of governmental and non-governmental supports are available in your area, whether that's a Department of Vocational Rehabilitation paying for therapy as part of getting someone back to work, or whether that's a nonprofit organization staffing certified instructors to teach folks who have recently lost vision. Depends a little bit on your location and what the structure is in your community. Do any of our other panelists want to add more as I kind of usurped that question?
I think you've covered it.
All right, Hilton, you had something else to add? Maybe? And Alt A is the keyboard command to unmute on many computers.
think they may just still have their hand raised. We do have another guest that would like to ask a question. So I will go ahead and
Sure. Chino Sono, would you like to ask a question out loud?
Yes, thank you. All right. I work with a social impact organization here in Nigeria, and just recently we conducting a landscaping analysis to understand the needs of students living with disabilities in a university here. The preliminary study, the data we found showed that most of them do not have access to edutech services. And of course, we are planning to implement a kind of a work to enhance inclusivity. And it has to do especially with those that are blind, because we found that the only thing that they have are walking canes, and that is not enough. We want to implement an intervention. Will you advise on some of the edutech tools that we could have purchased for these people that would be friendly with their devices to ensure that they have inclusive learning? Because we found that most of them have inadvertently been excluded from the classes, the online space. They do not have any software embedded into their computers nor their phones that would help them. So, and it's quite appalling to see that. So, if there are recommendations that would enhance my intervention as we plan the project to meet some of their needs. Thank you.
Do we have a panelist who wants to jump on that question?
Well, this is Sarah. I'm not sure that I have an answer for everything there, but it certainly shows that this is a global issue in terms of making sure that students around the globe are getting access to the resources that they need. And there are several international organizations that are working towards better services for blind students in other countries as well. Um, you know, basic places to start. It sounds like maybe some students don't have access to assistive technology. Um, I think William brought up a couple, or like JAWS, which is a pretty expensive, can be an expensive piece of software, but there are other assistive technologies that are built into devices that don't require an additional payment. So that can be a good starting place if you're in a resource constrained area, or you're just trying to get started real fast. And that can be products like NVDA, which is a donation-based screen reader. Some operating systems have built-in magnification. Apple products tend to have voiceover. And then if you're using a mobile device that supports Android, they also have TalkBack. And every person has a different preference for what kind of technology that they use, but it's great to know that there are free technologies out there. And then in terms of, kind of getting started and making sure that people have access to their coursework, raising awareness about these issues, and letting people know about kind of the basic steps that they can be taking is really helpful. We're talking about educational technology, even starting with things like color contrast and describing images using the built-in accessibility features in word processing to make sure that images have alt text, making sure that documents have headers, and that you're using sufficient font sizes. That's a great place to start. And of course, getting students access to their coursework so they're able to participate is a really big journey. But maybe those are just a couple things to get started.
And that's a great segue to another question that asked, are there AI tools that can help analyze images to generate descriptions? So as Sarah mentioned, sometimes that is built into the assistive technology now. There are also several standalone AI tools that will generate an attempted image description for a picture, either one you find digitally in software or one you take with the device's camera. And in both cases, they can give folks a really good starting point, and they can also be tricky or insufficient when they make errors or have hallucinations, as AI is prone to do. We have a question about the Title II updates, and does this apply to national testing companies such as the College Board?
This is Sarah again. So testing services are a unique component of the ADA, but to the extent that the covered entities, state and local governments, including public schools and public universities, are using these testing services as part of their education, and there is an expectation that the tools that they are using should be accessible. The ADA broadly requires accessibility, and that's a longstanding interpretation of the ADA. But but there's some kind of legal nuances in the ways that these rules apply directly to a national testing company versus the way that they apply to the individual school or university that is using their services. So schools, when they are selecting a testing provider, should be selecting a testing provider that provides accessibility. And if for whatever reason they can't, like you kind of have a limited choice when you're trying to do an AP test, for example, then there's still the expectation that students are receiving reasonable modifications. And indeed, in some of these cases, students may need additional formats beyond just an accessible uh, digital interface. I hope there's more to that answer, but I think that's maybe the basics of it.
Excellent. We have a few questions around software companies that are developing tools to make digital data accessible. Are there particular aspects that they should consider to develop to make website content more accessible, or particular issues that folks have when visiting websites that make it difficult to access content?
Well, I would just say that this is where it's really great that we have a standard now. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines provide some pretty specific information on what it means to be accessible. So I see one of the questions asked about low vision. And in that case, you might be looking at color contrast. You might be looking at whether the text is designed in a way that is fixed on a screen, or whether it can adapt to your size of the screen, and that way that it makes it easier to use with a magnifier. It makes it easier to use on a large screen or a small screen. And some websites will choose to build their own features so that you can choose which font size you're using. Those are just a couple things for low vision, but contrast and the ability to manipulate the font size are two places to start.
Excellent. And Sarah, I have to drop off now. Can you take over choosing the next questions?
Sure. We have a couple more questions. We will stay on for about 5 more minutes to try to get through questions. We understand that a lot of people may need to drop off right as we get to 1 o'clock. But we'll keep going to try to get some more questions answered. There's a question that asks how often WCAG is updated. And so the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines are updated every, I don't know, it could be 3 to 10 years. There is actually the most recent version of WCAG is 2.2. And so we're really excited to see that update. It provides some guidelines for accessibility features that go beyond the WCAG 2.1 standard. But to meet the legal requirements, you will be okay if you meet 2.1, but it's always great to be striving to meet the latest standard as well. There's a question that asks, any particular issue that you faced normally while visiting the website and don't find it easy to access the content? I know that May and Ariel talked a little bit about some of the common accessibility features. Do y'all want to talk a little bit more about what the impact of some of those accessibility barriers might be?
Sure. So I can talk a little bit about what we learned about web and app accessibility barriers in general. In terms of the types of barriers that people experienced, the most common type of barrier was unlabeled elements, so buttons or images or controls or combo boxes or any sort of element on either the website or the app that the screen reader could not identify properly. Or if the person used screen magnification and text being too small or the being poor contrast were also frequent issues that people experienced. Um, and some of the consequences of experiencing those barriers included an inability to access key services. So obviously in the case of education, that would mean being unable to receive or unable to participate in an educational program without extra supports, like getting a sighted person to provide support. A lot of people reported feelings of frustration and exclusion. Um, it creates a burden on others, like sighted people that might have to be recruited to assist with inaccessible websites and apps. It also creates kind of an indirect burden on businesses because in our survey, about 41% of the website users and 44% of the app users said that one of the ways that they deal with accessibility issues, if they can, is to switch from one provider to another. So, just as an example, if they're shopping on Walmart's website and they have trouble accessing things on the site, they'll just not buy anything at Walmart. They'll switch over to Target, etc. So accessibility issues, do have downstream impacts on the businesses that are providing the goods or services. There were a lot of stories of people using websites and apps for shopping or trying to go shopping and basically just giving up because it wasn't worth the trouble to try to figure out what was available when the site wasn't fully accessible.
And I think we have a hand from Christina Vanoy, or it just went away. Christina, did you want to ask a question?
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. No, I just wanted to put in there. I didn't know if you guys saw my stuff, but like I'm a teacher of the visually impaired, and I have really found that seeing AI app has worked really well for my low vision students. As far as like currency and accessibility, as far as like reading something, because let's face it, all of our teenagers have their phones. So it is good for my lower vision students to have that. And then for my completely blind students, Be My Eyes is very good as well for my completely blind students. A prime example is one of my students who has no functional vision has to dissect a frog, and they have to tell the difference between male and female. So instead of me trying to verbally describe that to him, I just found pictures online and then was able to in turn send it to him via email. And then he was able to describe it with Be My Eyes, because we were trying to figure out, like you guys were saying, like, how are we going to get this picture? Because he has jaws. How are we going to get this picture to describe and do, everything? And so we were trying to figure it all out. And then we finally were like, oh, duh. So we ended up taking the picture with Be My Eyes, and then I sent it to him via text, and then it described everything to him. So I wanted to make sure that you guys were aware of those two apps, which are completely free.
Thank you. And I did mention that Be My Eyes is also available on the computer as well as on the phone. So I use it. I'm a blind person and I use Be My Eyes for describing images on screen and describing images that I have saved to my hard drive.
Great, thank you. And then we have a last question from Kim Avila, and then we will close the webinar.
Hi there. Thank you for taking my hand raised. This is Kim Avila. I'm at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. And I wanted to mention a study that I conducted on common accessibility issues in teacher created content and what was said earlier about contrast and size of font and everything else. In the study that I conducted, the most common accessibility error that was found was actually teachers taking screen captures of text and content and putting that in their slides or saving their slides as an image or a PDF as an image. And that while we can, when we have an accessible PowerPoint, if we have a PowerPoint that is not an image, we can change the background, we can change the contrast and the color fairly easily. But when teachers are literally taking screen captures of content and text and putting it in their slides and worksheets, it's really inhibiting our students' ability to access it with JAWS or Narrator or NVDA or their Braille displays, or if they have low vision, to be able to see it clearly. It's also impacting a lot of students who have learning disabilities and who have different types of print disabilities as well. So for the TVIs out there, one of the main things you can encourage your students, teachers to do is to make sure they include the actual text and not images of the text. Otherwise, we have to put it through OCR and retrofit it, and that's when it gets really time consuming.
That's a fantastic point. Thank you for raising that and for sharing that you have some additional research out there about teacher created materials. So I know that there are a lot of professors and researchers in the field who are doing great work to investigate and improve accessibility. So thank you for your role in that.
Thank you.
Ariel, do you want to close this out?
All right, thank you, everybody. If there's any questions that we didn't get to, feel free to send us an email at research@afb.org and check your inbox tomorrow. You will get a copy of the slides, a recording of this presentation, and a post-webinar evaluation survey. We really appreciate you taking a couple minutes to fill that out because it will help us improve for our future webinars. Thanks so much.